Hello, and welcome to the Raising Risk-Free Teens podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl LaBelle. In this risky world we live in today, we want to equip parents to help their teens avoid unnecessary risk. We'll touch on hot topics of the current culture. We'll talk about sexual risk avoidance and any other important information to keep you informed as a parent. All of our topics are rooted in science, facts, and medical accuracy, not opinion. Thanks for listening and hope you enjoy the podcast. Somatic responses are an automatic nervous system reaction, not a choice. Let me repeat that again. Somatic responses are an automatic nervous system reaction and not a choice. When someone has experienced trauma, their nervous system processes it in a way that is physiological and not just a cognitive or emotional response. In other words, a person may not be able to think their way out of a trauma response because the body is driving the behavior. Let's explore this topic further with special guest and therapist Karen Riley. Hi, Karen. Thanks for being here with us today.
Hi, Cheryl. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good. I'm excited to explore this topic because I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do think we encounter a lot more people than we would realize who are having some somatic responses.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, help us better understand what this means.
Yeah. Somatic responses just mean it's how your body is holding, processing, and dealing with the trauma that you've been through.
Okay. So with our line of work, and even for this podcast, Raising Risk-Free Teens, right? So talking to parents and other caring adults who interact with a lot of children and even teenagers. And I know that there's a lot of developmental differences. So probably if we're talking about children versus teenagers, it might look a little bit differently. But for our teenagers, how does that show up physically in teens differently from adults? Because our audience, they are adults. That's what they're going to relate to. But if we're looking at our teens, how does that show up differently for them?
Yeah, in teens, it can show up, in physical ways that we may not piece together as a direct result of the trauma. GI issues are a big common complaint with teens. If they have been through a traumatic event of any kind, headaches, upset stomach, muscle tension. And, a lot of those can be similar for adults, but with adults, we tend to see more chronic inflammation, cardiac events.
Because it's built up over time.
Yes.
And really that should stand out in a teenager because most teens are pretty healthy. And so they shouldn't be struggling with like the muscle fatigue or tension or those kinds of headaches and stomach aches, things like that.
Yeah, and, when we're looking at teens, there's usually like 3 to 4 different behaviors that parents can look at. And the first were obviously those somatic responses, how is the body responding to the trauma? And again, I emphasize, GI issues, musculoskeletal, ailments, the muscle tension, et cetera. But there's also, brain development and neurological function that can come into play. The younger a trauma occurs in a person, the more difficulty they can have figuring out just basic calming skills. For instance, I'll give you an example from my own life. So, for instance, in my own life, I was sexually abused between the ages of 3 and 11. There were 6 different offenders in there. And, I remember in elementary school struggling with headaches. And then, fast forward, I dealt with a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression in my teenage years, and I never could pinpoint that until years later when I actually received help for what I endured as a kiddo.
Yeah, that makes sense. From the outside, having this conversation and hearing this, all of these pieces, it makes sense that those would be ways that the body would respond. And we do hear there are books and webinars that are out there, talking about the body remembers.
Yes.
And because it holds on to it, but it doesn't remember it like it's a memory. It remembers the trauma as a response to protect itself.
Yes, because what happens is we have this little piece in our brain called the amygdala, and it is our basic fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And so what happens when trauma has entered the scene, especially at a younger age, those neural pathways have been impacted. And so when, for instance, in my own life, when I was in a stressful situation, my default was to panic because that amygdala was in what we call a hijack state. And so part of what we do, what I do in the counseling room is I explain, the amygdala is similar to a teapot. When the whistle or you're waiting for the whistle and there's what's the cap piece
Yes.
starts moving up and down.
Yeah.
I compare that to the amygdala. It's like your nervous system is trying to figure out, is this a true emergency or not? And so it's kind of in that hijack state. And so what's important is to have skills and ways to regulate.
Yeah, because it can seem irrational that a person would be responding this way.
Yes.
But to them, it is rational because they've experienced.
Yes. It feels very real to them. Not to say that it's not a real feeling, but their brain is just so used to that default mode, which is the hijacking of the amygdala.
Now, let's say that, we're on this side of saying trauma has happened, and so here's what we're seeing as a result. For a parent, maybe seeing this in their child, if they're not aware of trauma, what could alert them that might be what they need to look into rather than going to the doctor for Crohn's or irritable bowel or saying, well, you just ate too much sour candy, that's why your stomach's upset, or...
Yeah, there are actually some other behaviors that parents could be looking for, like are there sleep disturbances? Most kids who have experienced trauma, they might have trouble sleeping, or there's a rapid change in their sleep schedule. Like they may go to sleep at 8 o'clock every night, and then all of a sudden they're up later than normal because there's just been something that's happened to the nervous system that they can't regulate. And that's a very big piece of the difference between teens and adults. By adulthood, most of our nervous systems, unless we've been through severe trauma, is pretty regulated. And so that fight, flight, or freeze mode never gets regulated. And so behaviorally, there might be changes in, are there any sudden outbursts? Are there self-destructive behaviors? Cutting is a very common form with teens these days. Sometimes there will be what we call traumatic reenactment, and that's just where they will play out parts of the trauma that have happened to them. And I know I can relate to that. It wasn't quite in my teenhood, but my early childhood, I loved playing with Barbie dolls. And I now know the behavior of my Barbies was what was happening to me.
Trying to process it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's the brain trying to protect itself and protect the body and understand what is not really age appropriate at that time. So it's that would be such a hard.
And it's processing at that age. My youngest abuse occurred when I was 3, and I was 11 when I was raped. And so, my brain, that's a lot of trauma to pack in those years.
Yes, it is.
And so I look back on my life, and it's like, I understand now why I responded to people the way I did, to different situations how I did. I was never a trusting person. I still struggle with that at times, depending on the situation. There are points of irrationality that still follow me to this day. And it's like I know now how to handle and cope with that when I feel that panic or alarm.
Mm-hmm. All right, so back to that question, just to elaborate a little bit more with parents and their kids
Mm-hmm.
when they're watching these things happen. The teenage years, teens push back a lot,
Yeah.
and they can be obstinate towards authority, or they just don't like what parents maybe are saying, or a parent could easily say, my kid's just really emotional, and hormones, the
Yeah.
different changes. What I'm hearing, I think what I'm hearing is really, if we would see a pattern of these behaviors, you would start to say,
Yes.
this isn't just an outburst. This is bigger.
Right. For example, I remember in first grade, I became very fearful of going to school.
Hmm.
And none of the abuse happened at school. It's just the particular first grade teacher that I had, there was something very intimidating about her. And that I now know that was triggering me every single day going to school. And so I became afraid of going to school.
Yeah.
And so it's things like that, just noticing is there a sudden change in those kind of behaviors. Another one might be, are there people that the individuals are afraid of? Because, we know there's domestic violence or partner violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so what kind of behaviors are stemming from the time that he or she is spent with their partner?
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you said triggering, because that is kind of the next question too, or thought process there, of how certain characteristics, or if your kids continue to have these outbursts, what is a common factor that's triggering them? And if it doesn't seem like a natural, normal response to what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
is that an indication of something bigger going on that parents just aren't aware of?
Probably. I can't say for sure because every person is so different in how they process trauma and process emotional events in their life. You know, by nature, I think I was programmed to be an extrovert, but I am very much an introvert.
Mm-hmm.
And it is because of the trauma that made me that way. I'm much more guarded. And so
To
there's,
protect yourself.
yes, to protect myself. And so, there's that guarded behavior that can be manifested
Mm-hmm.
when they may not have always been that way.
Sure. So if there's some personality changes too.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned a teacher who had a very dominant personality, and that was triggering for you. What are
Mhm.
some other examples of trigger? And I know it's going to be different for every situation, but
Right.
in general, some examples of triggers for people?
For some people, like we said, that looks very different for each individual, but I'm thinking of some of my clients, for me, it was dominant personalities. For some people, it's tall people, because if this happens when they're younger, a tall person, it can be intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
And
And control.
yes, a lack,
A very physical
yeah.
presence of control.
And, for some people, the sense of not being in control can trigger that trauma response. And so, something that I work with my clients on is reframing the situation because coping skills are huge
Yeah.
when you've been through trauma. We're sitting here with our fidget toys as we speak. And so that is a very normal thing. And just one of the very first things I do when I have clients come in after I've found out what they've been through, we've done the intake, getting to know each other. I ask them, so what kind of coping skills do you have? And that is where we start because they need relief, right? And so we look at the fidget toys and we do a thing called bilateral stimulation. It's engaging pretty much both sides of the brain at the same time. And that's a whole rabbit hole for another day. Like we can get into EMDR therapy and those kind of things. But it's always good to have skills in your back pocket. I like to do deep breathing with all of my clients because that is something you can do anytime, anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And, Feet tapping is always a good one because you can do that in your shoes
Mm-hmm.
and nobody's going to see it, but alternating the feet tapping. Alternating is a huge component of that is what bilateral stimulation is. And I can think of a specific example. It was actually at a Clarity retreat a few years ago when we were climbing up the zip line ladder or tower to zip line, and the person behind me was starting to panic from the height.
Yes, but yet they still wanted to do it.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
yes. And I will say that was part of my inner fear that I was not letting show at the moment. And I said, hey, alternate your hands going up the railing.
Hmm.
And it calmed her enough to get to the top. And I'm like, it worked for me too. So we know this works.
Yeah. Physically doing something is
Yes.
activating some different parts of the brain, the
Yes.
chemicals being released to help. So if a person is, and we're getting a little deeper than just what parents can notice in teens,
Yes.
but I mean, if someone was listening to this, recognizing that they have some traumatic somatic responses in that moment when you're feeling anxious, when you feel like you can't control the situation or whatever that might be, these are some things that we can do to try and calm that amygdala and get back into control, to flip that lid, that teapot.
Yes.
And I have even heard too, verbally telling ourselves, I am safe.
Yes.
I am surrounded by safe people, or whatever needs to be said.
It's called positive self-talk. And actually, I was just doing that with a client this morning because she was nervous about something coming up today. And so reframing the situation and picking it apart is always very helpful. So I'm preaching to myself here, but when I go to the doctor, I have what's called white coat syndrome. My blood pressure, a somatic response, always goes sky high. And so I know when I go to the doctor that I have to take my blood pressure for about a week ahead of time, and I always take her the average of the week because it is sky high to the point where,
They're
hey,
concerned.
yes,
And it's not accurate,
correct.
but it's a somatic response to a fear.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And it's an irrational fear. And so, what does that mean? It means there's really no basis for the fear that I have. It is just a response from that trauma that happened a long time ago. It goes back to those neural pathways
Sure.
that were formed because they're like ruts, habitual ruts in our brain.
And so trying to create a new neuro pathway.
Yeah.
When we talk to students about neuroplasticity, we introduce that. And in part, we're trying to encourage them to have healthy habits and to set healthy habits, how it's easier to do when you're younger because your brain is more flexible. And so we will use like a marble in the sand.
Yes.
And I'll ask them, how many of you brush your teeth every night? And they raise their hand. And I said, how many of you think you're going to be brushing your teeth when you're 40, 50, 60? You have dentures. You're still going to clean them. And they're like, yeah. So that's a habit because you're creating this neural pathway.
Yes.
And the more you do something, the more you strengthen it. So it would make sense that when someone experiences trauma, the brain is going to try to protect itself and protect the body. And so sometimes people disassociate or there's, again, a whole nother rabbit hole we could probably go down, right?
This is fun stuff.
But it is really interesting because even if people haven't had a lot of trauma or heavy trauma, we still do some silly things that we don't understand why we do them.
Right.
But trying to break those habits. So,
I always tell my clients as long as they are healthy habits and they're not harming you or others, why not?
yeah.
For example, because of my trauma, I had figured out from a very young age that sucking my thumb was a source of comfort. And yes, to my kids, I am admitting this to the public. I sucked my thumb all the way into college because that was just something that soothed me for many, many years. And I never, parents always saw it as a bad habit.
Yeah.
But for me, that was truly a comfort. And another habit was I would stick my leg out from under the cover and jiggle it
Oh, mm-hmm.
It was a comfort, and you might see people twist their hair around. That's a
Mm-hmm.
common one. Those are what we call just self-soothing habits.
Yeah.
And
I've heard about people, applying pressure, whether they put their hand on their chest or maybe their arm or
yes,
kind of self-hugging themselves too.
yes. So there are, I forget the technical term for that, but we shortly call it tapping.
Mm-hmm.
And there are specific locations on the body by tapping, it can cause the nervous system to calm or regulate. And so that is something I'm kind of new at all this, and so I'm still learning a lot as I go, and I do want to look into the tapping further. Um, the butterfly hug is always a good one because you're applying pressure,
Yeah.
and we know that helps a multitude of people.
It can like release or it can reduce your blood pressure, right? Calm your heart rate.
Yeah,
It does some things like the body, we need touch.
yeah.
And our own hands on our arms is okay too.
Yeah, and something I've been excited to see in stores the past few years are the weighted blankets,
Yes.
because used to it was so hard to find those, and you'd have to make your own with rice and all this stuff. And so that's that goes back. That pressure just helps calm the nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen that in some arenas for like ADHD
Yes.
and trying to calm the brain. And I even saw something else too. Was a blanket that you somehow like kind of step into and pull up around you. And it's almost like cocooning where it's like being
Yeah.
hugged.
Yeah, it is. Now, I would not enjoy that. I would feel a little claustrophobic. I have to be able to move my feet.
Yes. No, I can understand that too. And it's interesting. And there are a lot of products I think that companies will sell. It sounds good and they can make a profit. But if it is something that, like you said, as long as it's not harming you or someone else, what a great
Yeah.
thing that you can use.
Coloring is a good activity. That is something we've done as an entire family, sitting around our dining room table after our family walked through a very dark period. We just sat there. It was quiet and it was just soothing.
It's like it gives your brain space to
Yes.
process without even having to say the things out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a very popular thing, actually, because, I mean, adult coloring books, there's a huge market for that. And I think people have found we also live in a very fast paced world. So some of the things, as you're talking about these, they're great for that somatic trauma response. But man, they're just great for us because it's the same brain, it's the same neuroscience and struggles and behaviors and how do we create healthier habits. And like you'd mentioned with those ruts, what we've created, it is hard to build new habits because if you think about that marble in the sand, it gets so deep. How do you pop that marble out to create a new habit or a new pathway? It's
It
almost
is hard.
impossible
And
sometimes.
that's, when I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No.
I get so excited about this because I have so many thoughts on all this. And just watching, I've learned this because I've lived it. And, I've worked with enough clients who have gone through deep-seated trauma that these approaches work. It's like those neural pathways can be changed because of the neuroplasticity. So how do we do that? We do that by being constant. I will introduce like a new skill or a new goal for a client. And I said, I know this may sound crazy, but it's the continuity that builds up over time.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it? It takes 21 days to form a habit. And so I will tell them, let's do this for at least 21 days and see how it goes. If you're not experiencing a change, we'll try something else. And that is the case. Some of this is trial and error because what works for you may not work for me and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, okay, so taking this back to that parent situation, if parents are living this, they're not aware that there's a trauma, they're seeing their child, there's this pattern, we as parents, we're trained, it's our responsibility to handle the situation, take care of it. Are there some responses that are not helpful in these situations?
So I think what's easy, and again, this goes back to my own personal experience. My first two children both have ADHD. And as a young mom who was not healed from her own traumas, I made a lot of parenting mistakes, and they know that, and we have discussed that. But, you know, defiance. We all know what that looks like. You know, I'm going to act out because I'm not getting what I want. Whereas dysregulation, the nervous system response, they truly can't control that response. And for us personally, the way that came to light was we were consistent with consequences, but it was not making any changes.
Yes, that pattern. So
Yes.
I can relate to that because I have a son who's ADHD, and then we're learning a little bit more about bipolar. And with that, gosh, I just thought it was impulse control issues, but you understand it's emotional dysregulation
It
and
is.
an inability, and then maturity is a little bit more delayed too, and so it gets complicated because even as you're talking about some of these somatic responses, I'm thinking I'm pretty sure that my children haven't had traumatic, because we have conversation. They haven't had a traumatic experience, but they have other neurological
Yes.
dysregulation, and so there's a lot of crossover again because
There
it's
is.
the same brain.
It is.
What's all these things that are happening? So it's interesting. Okay, so parenting mistakes. What should parents not do?
Do not yell at your child if you know that they have had this trauma.
Okay,
Yeah.
that'll probably trigger them.
Yes, it will. Triggering. We were talking about things that might trigger people. Gaslighting is another huge one.
Yes.
And basically what gaslighting is someone else is trying to state your reality is different than what it really is.
And as a parent, that would be really easy. I wouldn't think that I'm gaslighting, but to
Right,
say
right.
you're making something out of nothing, you're really fine, you're going to be okay, and the truth is they don't feel that. That's not their reality. So then you're not acknowledging them. You're just trying to dismiss them. You don't want to deal with them. And I think really as parents sometimes I don't know what to do. I can't understand. I think you're going to be okay, but maybe you're not.
Yeah, and an important part of that is not minimizing what they're feeling because they need to be validated that what they're feeling is very real. And we know what that feels like to be validated.
Yeah. So probably watching this happen with our children, if we're seeing a pattern and maybe trying to engage them in some conversation to find out if there's something that's happened. If we see that the way we are responding, they're not receiving or responding to us well, that again is setting up a pattern of behaviors that could indicate there's something more going on. Now, for parents who don't know how to handle this situation, when should they start looking outside of their own home? Like, when should they start seeking out professional help? Where do they start? How do they do that?
Yeah, if you have consistently tried to work with your teen, if the coping skills that you've been given are not helping, absolutely just reach out for help. They're NAMI.org, I believe.
National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Yeah, they have a lot of good tips on their website. People can reach out to local counseling firms. There are people who specialize in trauma.
And I think counselors and therapists are doing a better job
Yes.
of what they specialize in so that you can find a therapist who can speak specifically to trauma or ADHD or whatever it might be.
Yes, and the buzzwords that you want to look for when you're looking for that kind of help is trauma-informed care.
Okay.
Because that, they know going into the session, this person's had a trauma in their life, and it reframes how you interact with the client.
Now, I've seen a lot of like cognitive behavioral therapy. Does that also go into that trauma-informed, or is that more
Yeah,
a different field?
no, so what cognitive behavioral therapy is, you're changing or helping them change their thought processing. And it's a lot of reframing.
But you need that trauma sensitivity first,
Yes.
probably, before you come in and say, here, you
Yes.
need to be different.
Yeah. And it's, in those situations with a trauma person, you want to be sensitive to how you word things, how you come across to them. Because if you come across as a domineering person and it was, they were, let's say, abused by a parent, they're not going to receive that well. And so it's just being very cognizant of what the trauma was to begin with.
Yeah. And I was just thinking too, we recently, our team went into a local behavioral center. It's a residential, long-term residential for a lot of teenagers, anywhere from 3 to 6 months, sometimes a year. And as we presented our program on sexual risk avoidance, I don't remember the question that was asked, but how it came out. I cannot tell you how many young women and young boys, so 8th grade, well, really 6th grade through high school age, that they said that a parent, a trusted person, didn't believe me or told me that it was my fault.
Yeah.
And I want to put the best possible spin on it. I think in some situations for parents, we don't want to believe that this actually happened, and so we deny it and try to make that truth. But really, that's a gaslighting situation.
It is gaslighting.
Yeah. Or we have no idea how to handle it. And so if we can sort of dismiss it and minimize it, and then we don't really have to deal with it and everything's going to be fine and we can keep moving on. Because 1, I don't know how to help my child. And 2, I don't know how to feel towards this person that did this thing.
Right.
So there's a lot of layers to that too. And I guess I'm thinking in looking for a therapist, if we have a child or know someone, maybe it's not our child, maybe it's a friend of our child, or we're hearing some stories, what kind of suggestions could we give? I think that access to therapy, there's a lot more of that out there. When looking for keywords, even if we don't know what trauma has happened to our child, or if we think that it's a neurological ADHD type thing, finding someone who can do that cognitive behavioral therapy as well as being trauma informed, we can allow that therapist to have some conversation too to try to help our children, even if we're not that safe person for them.
Right. And it's something that's, it's been a learning process for me is it's not just one therapy framework that we use with any one client. We're pulling from all of these different frameworks that we've learned, like there's motivational interviewing, there's dialectical therapy. There's all these therapies that exist, and it's like I may not be able to name them, but I know I'm utilizing them.
Yeah.
And so that is a huge thing to realize. It's like just because we're looking for that trauma-informed care provider, they are going to use various modalities.
Yeah. Well, and I will say too, just encouragement, and not to pick on therapists, because I do very much appreciate all of that, but not every therapist is the right fit
Correct.
for every client. And so I think if someone finds themselves in a situation, my child needs help, and it does feel like a crisis once you figure it out and you're in that moment and you're trying to find them that help, not just for your child, but it's for us as parents too, right? How do we bring that control or sense of control back into our home life, but help for a healthy future? Understanding too that this therapist may not be the right one. You got to give it some time to see if it's the right fit and have good communication. So it's okay to change therapists, and it's okay to say that. At the same time, we do have to be patient because the trauma may have not taken time to happen, but it's been building for a lot of time. And so it takes time to come out of that.
And it's important, not only for the pairing to be proper, but to refrain from re-traumatizing the person as well. And that's a lack of maturity, I would say, in those situations, and it's like, that's my, I work closely with my clinical supervisor right now, and she reminds me often, if it's not a good fit, we can fire our clients.
Yeah.
And
because you want to do what's best for them.
Yes.
And you really have their best interest at heart
Yes.
in doing that.
It is, because I want to see that person succeed. I want to see them thrive because I know what it's like to live in that shackle of fear, doubt, worry, anxiety, panic attacks even. It's very important that people are aware that they can get plugged in for help because so many people suffer in silence until it's too late.
And my words of advice to parents, as much as we might want to come in and tell the therapist how to do it, what needs to happen, and what results we want, we also have to step back and let them do their job.
Yes.
We can ask questions, and especially if we have a minor, we can still be a part of that process. But I do think in conversation with people, sometimes it probably feels really easy to go, okay, now you work for me and here's what I want you to do.
Yes.
And that child has to build that trust relationship too with the therapist.
Absolutely.
There's just so many layers that go into it. And especially if we're handling such a sensitive topic,
It is.
it's important to coach the parents a little bit too, because this might be the first time that we're experiencing it on this side. And
It is. And, depending on what the trauma is or was, that child may not have even ever shared it with the parents. And so you're sitting there as the clinician knowing that the parents are puzzled as to why their child's behaving a certain way. And, it's very important. I go back, it's communication 101. You're talking with your client who is underage and trying to convey to them, it is important that your caregiver knows this piece of your life because it's going to help them help you better.
but they're the somatic response. There can be an
Yes.
irrational fear,
Right.
and yeah.
Yeah, and it's like you said, there are so many layers to what we're talking about. Like I could sit here and talk about the brain structure all day long because it's so fascinating. And in my own journey, when I heard about the amygdala, that was a turning point because I realized all of this pain or, the stress and worry I truly didn't have control over until I did.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, and that it's not your fault.
Yes.
But yeah, then also giving you a sense of control.
Yes.
And not that everything's going to turn out perfectly,
Right.
but goodness, it's got to get better.
Right.
So
Right. Because once you start gaining control over your thoughts, you can start training your brain on how to calm that amygdala. And that's the end goal, to gain control over the nervous system.
something that sounds so simple, yet is really quite complex.
It is, definitely.
But it does provide hope,
It does.
for sure. Any last words of wisdom for us?
Yeah, parents, don't be afraid to have the hard conversations with your kiddos. I keep saying communication is key in any relationship. And, communication is key in any relationship. And so we live in an age of technology where kids and parents have their heads in their phones.
Yes.
And so, I have even said to some people, if you have to, send them a text. Just that constant check-in, constantly be checking in with your kids.
That's excellent advice. Well, thank you so much for all of this. It has been very informative and helpful as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Clarity of Central Indiana. We hope you enjoyed today's topic. Be sure to leave us a review and share with your friends. You can find any links mentioned in the episode notes. Always remember that you have value, you have worth, you matter.